I can correct it. A homeless beggar answers a billionaire's cry and shows him what he couldn't see. The marker squeaked, then died in the hush. Inside the glass-walled boardroom at Coleman Aerospace headquarters in Seattle, a sketch of a narrow-body airliner sprawled across the whiteboard, lines colliding with lines, arrows arguing with arrows, numbers boxed and double underlined and still refusing to agree. Beyond the glass, rain stitched gray threads over Elliott Bay. Inside, the air felt like the moment before a storm when even the vents forget to breathe. At the head of the table, Billionaire CEO Richard Coleman braced both hands on the polished walnut and said, in a voice that shook more than he meant it to, "We have 48 hours. If we miss the fix again, we lose the contracts. We lose everything." Nobody moved. Senior engineers sat rigid, coffee gone cold at their elbows, laptops open to plots they no longer trusted. On a side credenza, a catering tray of croissants deflated into flakes, proof that time had been passing even though no one felt it. Someone clicked a pen once, then thought better of it. The room absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. The voice from the doorway was low, steady, and out of place. "I can fix it." Every head turned. Security had already taken a step when Richard lifted a hand without looking. The man at the threshold wore a frayed wool coat, and shoes dusted the color of sidewalk. His beard was overgrown, his hair badly negotiated with. He clutched a tired brown satchel to his chest the way people hold what's left after the world has taken the rest. Richard studied him. "What did you say?" "I can fix it," the man repeated. His eyes were fixed on the board, not the people. It was the look of someone recognizing a melody under noise. A young systems engineer whispered, "Who even let him up here?" Another, older, murmured, "Richard, this is insane." But desperation has a strange way of making room for courage, and Richard, his sleeplessness showing at the edges, slid the dry erase marker across the table. "If you waste our time," he said softer now, "you waste my company. Don't waste it." The stranger entered without apology. He smelled faintly of rain and paper. He didn't introduce himself or clear his throat. He just took the marker, faced the whiteboard, and stood motionless for 3 long heartbeats. Then he erased 2 furious arrows that cut across the wing platform and drew one clean line, unhurried, river straight. He circled a tiny box labeled AOA and wrote to its right, in block letters, "Sensor drift under vibration." 3 compact equations followed, not a blizzard, just a path. Under them, feedback loop overreacts, underlined once. Near the tail he added a tiny smiley face, not to be clever, but to mark a place in the model where, as he would later say, "The airplane wants peace." "What are you saying?" someone asked, more curious than combative. "When the airframe feels many small shakes." He tapped the AOA box. "This sensor starts to think the nose is too high. It panics. The autopilot shoves the nose down too fast. The pilots fight it, the system fights back. For a few seconds, everyone is loud, and loud turns into a fall." He drew a little sieve over the AOA line. "We slow the panic. Filter the noise so the sensor listens better. Then we make it ask 2 friends before it acts, airspeed and vertical speed." He tapped both. "If all 3 agree, we move. If one is shouting alone, we wait." On the margin he wrote 3 short rules. 1. Filter the noise. 2. Cross-check helpers. 3. Soft hands on the nose. "Soft hands?" the flight controls lead repeated. "The command slope," he said. "Define it." Gentle authority changes keep pilots and machine from starting a wrestling match. Richard's gaze sharpened. "And if turbulence gets worse?" "We tried a filter last week. It helped on the light stuff. In the heavy chop, the system still fought the crew." The man nodded and drew a small box tied directly to the yoke. "Pilot override early, with a thin time gate behind it. Give the human the bigger voice sooner. Let the software learn from the pilot's comm after it sees that comm twice. The machine must not be proud." A few smiles flickered around the table. Engineers are not known for loving metaphors, but that one landed. "What about false comm?" the guidance engineer pressed. Garbage in, garbage out. Suppose all three helpers lie together. They won't. Not often, he replied, not rude, just sure. He tapped the upper corner of the diagram and wrote, Sanity check 0.3s. Heartbeat monitor. If the rhythm looks wrong, cross-sensor residuals spike, covariance jumps, we tell the pilot first. Ask for hands? Soft hands? Something shifted in the room. Chairs creaked closer. Pens lifted but didn't tap. Even the HVAC hum seemed to tuck itself in to listen. Richard stepped nearer. Your name? The man kept his eyes on the board. William Anderson. Where did you learn this, Mr. Anderson? William's fingers brushed the satchel's edge where a dog-eared spine pressed against the fabric. Before, he said. From work. From mistakes. From watching the sky and listening when numbers get scared. The flight controls lead glanced at Richard, then at her team. Spin up a quick sim, she said, voice turning crisp. Implement his signal chain with a first-order low-pass on AOA, adaptive gain scheduling on pitch command, triple sensor voting with outlier suppression, and early pilot override. We'll hammer it with the rough case. Laptops opened like a flock of birds taking off. Code editors bloomed, unit tests scrolled, a projector washed the glass with a digital runway the color of wet asphalt. Someone slid William a chair. He didn't sit. Richard drifted to his side, lower now, as if talking too loud might spook the moment. William, where are you staying? William's grip tightened around the marker. Under the I-5, he said simply. No shame, just weather. On the screen the sim harness booted, plots waiting like held breath at the edges. The controls lead, Ava Morales, her badge red, checked her console. We'll start with the turbulence profile that broke our last patch. Richard nodded once. Run it. 3, 2, 1. The model rolled down the virtual runway, lifted into gray pixels of chop, and immediately the traces began to jitter. Everyone in the room knew the old beat that came next, the AOA spike, the runaway pitch down, the pilot fighting a machine that wouldn't listen. William didn't blink. He spoke in a voice meant for the airplane more than the people. Soft hands. On the left of the screen, the filtered AOA trace, normally a seismograph in an earthquake, rounded off, still alive but less frantic. Below it, the helper channels cross-checked. When they disagreed, the command stayed patient, a runner waiting the extra half-step to see the lane. A tiny banner flashed pilot priority, early as the yoke cue eased in and the software yielded like someone learning to listen. The bad story graph, the one that used to spike like a scream, began to look almost polite. The vertical speed trace dipped, but not like a cliff, more like a cautious bow. Residuals that once slapped red now flirted with amber and slid back toward green. Come on, someone breathed, not sure if they were talking to code or fate. A progress box in the lower right corner blinked pending, numerical margins tallying like a scoreboard counting up from 0. Richard's knuckles went white on the back of a chair. William let the marker roll gently into the tray. He didn't smile. He just watched. The projector flickered as the building lights hiccuped under a passing elevator surge. The image ghosted, then steadied. Ava's jaw worked once as she watched the last envelope metric crawl, hesitate, and the room held its breath as one organism, 50 heartbeats syncing to a digital pulse. Richard didn't take his eyes off the screen. If this holds, he said, half prayer, half warning, we start over. With you. William kept his voice even. With the airplane, he said. We just have to let it be what it is. On the plot window, a thin red threshold line waited, the kind nobody had crossed all week. The filtered AOA trace slid under it like a tide falling to slack water. The stability margin ticked up one last notch and froze at the edge of passing. The sim engine chewed for another second that felt like 10. Ava glanced at Richard. Ready for the final sweep? He nodded. No one spoke. Rain tapped the glass. Somewhere outside, a fairy blew a foghorn that sounded almost like hope. Final sweep, Ava said, and pressed run. The projector washed the glass in cool light as the final sweep began. Numbers marched in neat columns, traces braided and unbraided across the screen like nervous handwriting learning to calm down. At 20 seconds, the turbulence profile hit its nastiest patch. What had broken their last 4 attempts? The AOE trace twitched, then smoothed. Airspeed and vertical speed nodded in agreement. The command slope eased instead of snapping. A banner pulsed, pilot priority, early. The software yielded, not like surrender, but like respect. Someone whispered, "Hold, hold," as if they were spotting a friend under a heavy bar. The stability margin crept upward, paused at the red line that had mocked them for a week, then slid into green. The progress box blinked twice, stubborn as a pilot light, and flashed success in a solid, unapologetic green. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room detonated, chairs rolled back, hands flew to mouths, a strangled laugh escaped from somewhere near the glass. Ava Morales sagged against the credenza and let out a breath that sounded like the release of a year. Engineers who had been running on caffeine and dread all month were on their feet, clapping hard enough to sting. Richard Coleman didn't clap. Not at first. He stared at the screen, at the gentle curves where spikes used to live, and the careful choreography of filters and voting and soft hands. Then he turned, crossed the space in 3 strides, and pulled the stranger into a fierce embrace. "Thank you," he said into William's shoulder, voice breaking. "You just saved my company, and maybe lives I'll never get to know about." By the door, the guards who'd been ready to eject an intruder stood uncertain, then straightened as if they had always planned to be witnesses. Minutes later, in Richard's office, wood, glass, a rain-streaked view of the sound, William sat gingerly on a leather chair that felt too soft for someone who had learned to sleep on concrete. His brown satchel rested against his leg like a small animal that trusted only him. Richard paced once, twice. "You walked off the street into my boardroom," he said, part awe, part interrogation. "Who are you, Mr. Anderson? How did you see what a dozen of my best missed?" William's gaze dropped to the satchel. He unbuckled the flap and set a dogged book on aeronautical engineering on the desk. Its spine was cracked, paper thinned by weather and hands. Behind it, a rubber-banded stack of old certificates and a pen scarred by teeth marks. "This reminds me who I was," he said quietly. "Who I still am when the noise dies down." Richard Saturday. "Tell me." William folded his hands, the knuckles raw from more than code. "I'm William Anderson. I used to be a flight controls engineer, 10 years between Wichita and Everett. I wrote guidance logic for regional jets, patched sims at 3 in the morning, argued about gain schedules over cold pizza. I had a wife back then, Paige Baxter, and 2 boys, David and Jeremy. For a while, I thought the arc of the story was simple: work hard, fly straighter." He stopped, searching for words he hadn't used in a long time. "Then I got stupid. Suspicious. I ran a DNA test I should have never run. The results said the boys weren't mine." His voice thinned. "The morning after, I got pulled over on my way into the plant. They found oxy in my briefcase. I'd never touched it. Didn't matter. Mugshot. Arraignment. 16 months, good behavior. By the time I came out, the marriage was gone. So was the house. My name didn't pass background checks. I wasn't a person to hire anymore. I was risk." Richard's jaw worked. Rain stitched harder against the glass. "I did day labor," William went on. "Fixed lawn mowers behind a pawn shop. Read this," he tapped the book. "Until pages came loose. When the nights got too long, I slept under I-5. You learn the schedule of trucks that way, and where the concrete keeps you dry." He didn't cry. He had already done that part of his life. Richard stood so fast his chair bumped the credenza. Decision put steel back in his voice. He picked up his phone. "Tom, bring the car to the front. We're going 2 places, Burke's Barber Shop on Pike, then Wilkes and Hart across the street." "Yes, open a tab." "No, not the discount rack. He's coming back here when he looks like the man he is." William started to protest. Richard lifted a hand. "You gave me my company back," he said. "Let me give you your reflection." 2 hours later, A mirror offered a version of William he recognized from the edges of memory. Beard trimmed close, hair neat, lines on the face still there but no longer the whole story. At Wilkes and Hart, a tailor ghosted around him with pins and calm authority. A gray suit settled on his shoulders like a truce. White shirt, sober tie, shoes that didn't remember rain. When they returned, the boardroom was full again. Word travels fast in a building where terror has been replaced by relief. Richard stepped in first, then motioned to the door. "Team," he said. "Meet the man who saved your weekend and our contracts." He tilted his head toward William. "From this moment, Principal Engineer, Flight Controls. He will set the direction. We will follow." Applause answered. Some of it was thunderous, some polite, some startled into existence before the person behind it decided how they felt. A few of the younger engineers grinned like kids meeting a favorite pitcher. Ava Morales crossed to William, stuck out her hand, and shook his like a colleague, not a miracle. "Welcome to the part where we turn a fix into a foundation," she said. "I'll start assembling a tiger team. You choose the stack." William nodded, grateful for the language of work. "We'll keep the rules short," he said. "Short rules get remembered in the dark." Near the back wall, a man in a navy sport coat stood with his arms folded just a little too tight. Early 40s, square jaw, the sort of competence that had won the lead share until today. His badge read Owen Kincaid, the outgoing head of flight controls. He clapped, a clean, steady rhythm, eyes cool as winter water. When those eyes cut to Richard, something unreadable passed between old trust and new math. The meeting bled into a war room. Whiteboards multiplied. The sim harness grew teeth. William drew boxes and arrows that stayed friends. He assigned small, sharp problems to people who looked like they'd been waiting their whole careers to be trusted. By 6, the floor smelled like pizza and dry erase solvent. By 9, like victory and exhaustion. Sometime after 10, as the building emptied to a skeleton crew, William stepped to the window. Seattle at night looked like a circuit board. Yellow traces, red diodes moving along I-5, the sound a dark ground playing. His reflection wore a suit. The ghost behind it still knew the underpass. He pressed his palm to the glass. It was cool and honest. A shadow joined him in the reflection, Richard, coffee in hand. "You good?" "I'm standing," William said, surprised to find that the word felt right. Richard's voice turned low. "There will be press. Partners. Regulators. I'll put my shoulder in front of yours where I can. Where I can't, we tell the truth and let the work speak." William nodded. "Let the airplane be what it is," he said again, almost to himself. Across the room, Owen Kincaid watched them both. He wore the look of a man learning a new map while mourning the old one. Behind the polite line of his mouth, a thought set like concrete. This isn't how my story ends. On the whiteboard, under the neat rules William had written, someone had added a fourth line in a different hand: protect the fix. No one erased it. The next morning, Seattle woke under a pale sky. Ferries moved like white chess pieces across Elliott Bay, and Coleman Aerospace headquarters hummed with an energy the building hadn't felt in months. Engineers streamed through the glass doors, their steps lighter, their conversations alive. The word had spread, the fix worked. Inside the boardroom, William Anderson stood at the head of the whiteboard, a fresh marker in hand. He no longer looked like the man who had slipped past security the day before. His suit fit clean, his beard was trimmed, but his eyes carried the same quiet weight. He drew diagrams with steady precision, while Ava Morales and a dozen others scribbled notes. "Filter first, cross-check second, override third," he repeated, tapping each rule as though he were setting commandments in stone. Simple. Rememberable. When chaos hits, complexity kills. Clarity saves. Heads nodded around the table. Some smiled. A few still held cautious reserve, but the tide had shifted. William was no longer an intruder. He was their leader. Richard Coleman leaned in the corner, arms folded, watching. For years he had thrown money at problems, recruited talent from MIT and Stanford, but no one had seen the flaw so clearly. No one had cut through noise with such humility. He felt both relief and guilt, the relief of survival, the guilt of knowing a genius had been sleeping under an interstate, while his company paid 6 figures for blind guesses. At noon, Richard called a press conference. The atrium filled with reporters, cameras blinking like stars. William hesitated in the wings, clutching his satchel, still uncomfortable with attention. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stand beside me," he said firmly. "They deserve to know who saved them." When Richard stepped to the podium, his voice carried the weight of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis at Coleman Aerospace is over. Yesterday, in this very building, a breakthrough was made that will redefine the safety of our aircraft. And it came from a man who walked in off the street. A man who proved that genius doesn't wear a suit, it carries a satchel." He gestured, and William was pulled into the light. Applause rippled across the room. Camera shutters clicked like rain. William cleared his throat. "I'm not here for glory," he said simply. "I'm here for the airplanes. Machines should serve the people, not the other way around. If you teach them to panic, they'll panic. If you teach them patience, they'll listen. All I did was remind the system to be patient." The crowd murmured with admiration. Headlines were already forming in the minds of journalists. Homeless engineer saves aerospace giant, Seattle miracle fix. But not everyone was clapping. At the far edge of the atrium, Owen Kincaid stood with his arms folded, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. Just 24 hours earlier, he had been the man in charge, the one Richard trusted. Now, he was a shadow in his own house, watching the team orbit around a stranger. Every cheer for William felt like a hammer pounding into his pride. As William stepped down from the podium, Ava Morales touched his arm. "You don't realize it yet," she whispered, "but you've just changed everything." William gave a small smile. "I just fixed what was broken." But Ava was right. That day was not just a fix, it was the start of a new era. And in the quiet corners of the building, Owen Kincaid's envy hardened into something darker. He forced a polite smile when others looked, but inside, a single vow coiled like a spring: this isn't over. The day after the press conference, Seattle felt new. The newsroom vans were gone from the curb, the atrium had its echo back, and the war room on the 10th floor beat like a heart. William Anderson moved through it with a legal pad tucked under his arm, listening more than he spoke, assigning problems like a coach handing out positions, small, sharp, winnable. He kept the rules on the board where everyone could see them: filter the noise, cross-check the helpers, soft hands on the nose, and added a fourth beneath Ava's scrawl: protect the fix. Respect found him quickly. Not the glossy kind that vanishes when cameras do, but the quiet sort that shows up as extra chairs around your table at lunch. He didn't perform genius. He made space for it in other people. Interns who rarely got airtime found their ideas on the sprint board. Veterans who had given up proposing bold changes heard him say, "Let's test it," and believed he meant it. In finance, Julia Bennett watched this from a floor away. She was a senior analyst in FP&A, numbers neat as stacked cups, voice soft enough to disappear until she chose not to. Their first conversation was an elevator accident, doors closing, William jogging up with a hand between them, Julia wedging in with a cardboard tray of coffees. "Sorry," he said, catching a spill with a napkin. "You just saved the avionics budget," she said without looking up. "I can spare a latte." Then she glanced at him and added, "I'm Julia." "William," he said, as if it might still be a question. They started small. She left a mug of tea on his war room table during a midnight code review and slipped away before he could thank her. He carried a box of audit binders down to her conference room because she was trying to open the door with an elbow. They learned the same city from different angles: a fast bowl of chowder by the stalls at Pike Place, a long walk under the string lights on the waterfront, a ferry ride to Bainbridge where he stood at the rail like a person measuring out a second life. With Julia, the past didn't disappear, it quieted. She had a way of laughing that made grief forget its script, and a way of listening that treated silence like a thing worth keeping. Richard Coleman noticed. One afternoon he stepped into the war room, looked over the plots, then looked at William the way a man looks at a house he almost lost. "You still sleeping under the freeway?" "No," William said. "You don't get good ideas under trucks." "Good," Richard said, and slid a leather folder across the table. Inside were keys and a deed. "Mercer Island, East Side. It's company housing for executives, but executive is just a word we use when indispensable sounds like too much." "I can't," William started. "You already did," Richard said. "Let me catch up." The house was steel and glass with a cedar deck that stepped down to the water. The first night William stood in the dark kitchen and watched lights move on the lake like slow constellations. He slept in a bed that didn't remember rain. By spring, the fix had gone from patch to doctrine. Regulators visited, poked, and left with more questions about the coffee than the code. Partners who had waited with pens uncapped signed hard. The head of a rival sent a note that began, begrudgingly, "Well done." On a Sunday evening in May, William took Julia to Cary Park at Blue Hour. The city stood lit like a promise, the space needle in profile, the sound a sheet of black glass. He held a ring that felt heavier than metal and lighter than fear. "I don't know how many fresh starts a person gets," he said, "but I know this one only counts if you take it with me." Her yes came out as a laugh drowned in a tear, which is the right grammar for joy. They set a date in late summer. The company reacted like extended family. Facilities offered the atrium for a reception if it rained. Security volunteered a motorcade as a joke and then, half seriously, insisted. Ava claimed DJ rights and began the world's most chaotic playlist. Richard, who had no daughters, talked too much about venues and then pretended he hadn't. Somewhere behind all this, Owen Kincaid watched and didn't clap. He had been reassigned to an architecture council with a new title and a smaller room, a lateral move the way a cul-de-sac is a road. His smile worked in public. In private it didn't reach his eyes. On a Thursday night in Soto, in a bar that served beer by the bucket and light by the watt, Owen sat in a back booth with a man whose knuckles looked like they'd had careers. Dante Cruz ran a security, consultancy, that filled the spaces HR didn't like to name. "I want a problem removed," Owen said, voice thin at the edges. Dante tipped a bottle back, watching Owen over the glass. "You want him scared, hurt, or gone?" Owen's jaw clicked once. His cuff link flashed in neon. "I want him broken. Make sure he can't stand where I used to." Dante shrugged as if sliding a coat on. "Broken is cheaper than gone and keeps you off the front page. Cash up front. No text messages. No names." An envelope changed hands. The bar's television showed a game no one was watching. The night before the wedding, the Mercer Island house was mostly quiet. Rentals returned, florists rehearsed routes, Julia at her sister's condo in Queen and with too many opinions about hairpins. William sat on the living room rug with his old aeronautical book open to a page the rain had once eaten. He traced a finger along a diagram he knew by memory. He thought of concrete, and code, and the way a second chance sounds when it knocks. The knock came at 10:43 p.m. He frowned. Security rotated at 10. He rose, smoothed a hand down his tie out of habit, and opened the door. 3 men stood on the porch in dark jackets that tried to look like nothing. The front one lifted a pistol from the fold of his coat and fired before the porch light finished blooming. Fire cracked across William's upper arm. He stumbled back into the entryway, catching himself on the console table, knocking a bowl of keys to the floor. The gun barked again, louder inside. Glass burst somewhere behind him. The men were gone as quickly as they came, boots on cedar, the quick gasp of a gate, an engine starting hard. The alarm found its voice. Lights strobed across the lawn as the exterior cameras woke. William pressed his palm to heat and felt wet. He told himself to breathe. He told himself to count. Security arrived at a run, radios crackling. "Call 911. Someone said, already on with dispatch. "Harborview," another answered, because in Seattle there is only one place you go when something tears. The ambulance sang him across the bridge, a red thread drawn through the night. William watched the ceiling lights scroll above him, fluorescent, 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 and thought absurdly of runway centerlines. He kept his eyes open until the edges blurred and the noise turned to cotton. At Harborview Medical Center, doors banged open and the team swallowed him whole. Scissors, gauze, a voice near his ear that sounded like it belonged to someone who knew how to win arguments with blood. He lost the thread when the mask came down. Julia arrived still in sneakers, hair half-pinned, hands shaking the way a structure shakes at the edge of design. Richard came in a step behind her, face collapsed past the point of pretending. He sat them in a family room where televisions show other people's normal and stared at a door that didn't care who he was. When the surgeon finally pushed through, the clock on the wall said a time that felt like a lie. "He's alive," she said, leading with the verb that fixes you to your chair. "Through and through to the upper arm, clean miss on the artery. We repaired what needed repairing. He'll keep full function with rehab. He was lucky." Julia caught the word like a person catching a glass before it hits tile. "Lucky," she cried into it. Richard stood with both hands on the back of a chair and swallowed 3 times before the breath went where air goes. Luck is not a strategy, William would say later. But that night, it was enough. By morning, SPD detectives had pulled camera footage from street after street, a necklace of pixels from Mercer Island to I-90. One frame caught the plate. Another caught a face, blurred but not enough. A unit found the car in Rainier Valley, engine still hot. Inside the glove box, a business card with an embossed shield and a name, Cruz Protective, LLC. When the detectives knocked on Dante Cruz's office door in an industrial park near Georgetown, Dante didn't act surprised. He acted tired. He surrendered on the sidewalk with his hands up, as if he'd been carrying them too long. Under lights that made truth more likely, Dante gave them a retainer check stub from a meeting in Soto, a description of a booth, and a name he had not written down because men like him think paper is the only thing that testifies. "Owen Kincaid," he said, and watched the room change temperature. By dusk, a Warren had a key in Owen's front lock in Bellevue. Officers went in calm and came out with a man whose cuff links looked ridiculous against plastic restraints. Owen said words like misunderstanding and overzealous contractor, then stopped when the detectives slid phone records across the table. The tower pings, the one call that should not have been made from a number he didn't think anyone knew he had. In a hospital room where the machines exhaled softly, Julia held William's uninjured hand and pressed her forehead to his knuckles. He woke to the sight of her eyes and the feel of tears he didn't deserve and did anyway. "You're here," he said, voice raw. "I'm not leaving," she said. Richard stepped into the doorway and put a hand on the jamb like a man asking permission to burden a room with relief. "They have him," he said. "And the man he paid to do it." William closed his eyes, not to sleep but to keep the fury from spitting. When he opened them, he looked at Julia first, then at Richard, then at the window where Seattle's morning would be if the blinds were open. "I won't lose this life again," he said, not loud but so certain the walls heard it. Outside, the sky began to lighten, the color the sound turns just before the day decides. Inside, a detective tested the edge of a statement with a recorder and a pen. In King County, some trials are spectacles and some are cleaning. This one would try to be both. The case moved fast for something that large. While William learned to zip sweatshirts one-handed in physical therapy and practiced grip strength with a rubber ball, detectives braided together plate reads, camera angles, cell tower pings, and the tidy confessions of a contractor who had decided prison was easier with a deal. The King County prosecutor filed charges, attempted murder and criminal conspiracy, and the courthouse on 3rd Avenue began to feel like a stage. Judge Eleanor Park ran the room the way a good captain trims a ship, small adjustments, never louder than necessary. Reporters took the first 3 rows. Engineers from Coleman Aerospace filled a patch near the aisle, badges still clipped to belts as if they'd been afraid to stop moving. Richard Coleman sat beside Julia, protective in a way that made him look younger and older at once. When Owen Kincaid entered in a dark suit that tried to pretend nothing had happened, the room performed the same quiet intake of breath. He looked polished. But polished is not the same as clean. The state went first. A detective narrated a necklace of video, taillights on Mercer Island, a blur under I-90, a camera that blinked awake at Rainier Avenue just in time to catch a plate. A forensics tech placed shell casings in evidence trays and matched striations like fingerprints. Then Dante Cruz took the stand, knuckles calm, voice flatter than his booking photo. "We were hired," he said, eyes avoiding Owens by a professional margin. "The instruction was break him. Mess him up enough to stop the wedding and put his career in a sling. We were told, no body bags, no headlines, just fear." "Who told you that?" the prosecutor asked. "Mr. Kincaid," Dante said, looking at the jury this time as if the shortest path out of a bad room is a straight line. The defense tried to turn the story, an overzealous contractor, a miscommunication, a payment for personal protection consultation. That had gone sideways. But then came the phone records, a burner used once from a tower a block from Owen's condo, a second number that shouldn't have existed at all. The jurors leaned in the smallest amount. Small amounts matter. William took the stand last. The sleeve of his jacket sat a little looser over the surgical bandage. The scar beneath it itched in the way new skin itches when it is trying to decide what to remember. He told the story without ornament, doorbell, flash, heat, keys shattering in a ceramic bowl, cedar steps, siren. When the prosecutor asked what he was thinking as the ambulance crossed the bridge, he said, "That I had finally been given back a life worth protecting. And that I wasn't going to let anyone take it." Julia testified right after, no theatrics, just the truth put into complete sentences. "He doesn't scare easy," she said, eyes steady. "He does the next correct thing. That's who he is." On the fourth afternoon, Judge Park read the instructions. The jury vanished into a room with a coffee pot and the weight of other people's tomorrows, and the rest of them learned the special time that only courthouses know. 2 hours later, the foreperson stood. "Guilty on all counts." Sound drains strangely in a courtroom. Some people gasp. Some don't breathe at all. Richard's hand found William's shoulder. Julia closed her eyes, then opened them again because this part you should see. At sentencing, the judge chose words like a surgeon chooses tools, only what the moment required. "This wasn't a mistake," she said to Owen. "It was a plan. And plans have consequences." She set the numbers down, 20 years, and the bailiff's hand became the final punctuation. As officers turned him, Owen twisted once toward the gallery, toward Richard and William, toward a future he just tried to ruin and failed. His voice carried like a knife thrown in a quiet room. "This isn't over." William didn't stand. He didn't flinch. He said, just loud enough to reach, "It is for you. The world has a way of snapping back to the things that were waiting while you were in court." The next week, William finished rehab and returned to the 10th floor to a whiteboard that still held 4 rules and a 5th someone had added, protect the fix. He shook a dozen hands and answered the same question 20 times. "Does it hurt?" With the same answer. "Less than before." They pushed the wedding a month. On a clear September Saturday, they said vows at St. James Cathedral, sunlight falling in long, clean columns. William slipped a ring onto Julia's finger with a hand that had learned its strength back, and when the priest said the words that return the world to you, the place erupted, engineers and accountants and line techs cheering like a launch. For the reception, Richard had insisted on the Museum of Flight. They danced under the black razor of the State Route 71, cut cake in the shadow of a DC-3, and took photos beside a Boeing 247 that wore its age like a medal. Ava Morales DJ'd, badly and perfectly, because the playlist only needed to get one thing right: joy is loud. That night on Mercer Island, the house did what houses do for the right people: it kept them. William stood barefoot on the deck, lake glass dark at his feet, and tried to put into one breath the miles between concrete and cedar. He didn't manage it. Some distances you live, you don't measure. Fall turned to the kind of winter Seattle does: wet, patient. Coleman Aerospace turned the fix into doctrine, then into training, then into muscle memory. Regulators nodded with the caution of people who don't nod easily. Contracts that had hovered signed and stayed. A rival sent a second note that said, less begrudgingly, well done again. In late spring, Julia gripped William's hand in a delivery room at Swedish First Hill, and a tiny boy took the first angry gulp of air that makes adults cry. They named him Clinton James Anderson. William pressed his lips to the downy crown and made a promise he didn't say out loud. You will never meet the version of me that slept under concrete. You will grow up where roofs don't leak and machines know how to listen. Nights found him in a soft chair with Clinton asleep on his chest, the house breathing quiet around them. Sometimes he'd trace the curve of a tiny ear and think about command slopes and gentle hands, and decide that good engineering is just another way of saying, don't overreact to noise. Still, shadows do what shadows do. From Monroe Correctional Complex, letters moved without stamps, messages sent with kitchen whispers and yard nods. A rumor about favors owed. A name William had never heard alongside one he had. Richard's security chief met him in the atrium with a folder, and the kind of face that tells you the good part is over. Threat chatter thin but not nothing, she said. We're shoring the perimeter. SPD's looped in. We'll be gray and boring about it. William looked down at the photograph of a graffiti scrawl taken 2 neighborhoods from the plant, soft hands break, and felt the old muscle in his chest test itself against fear. Then Clinton stirred in his arms, made a sleep sound like a tiny engine turning over, and the muscle decided. We don't live scared, he said to Julia that night, drawing the blinds and checking the door once, no more. We live careful. There's a difference. The next morning, he kissed his son's forehead, tied his tie, and drove into a city that had once tried to shake him off. The 10th floor smelled like coffee and solvent and work. On the board, the rules waited where they always did. Filter the noise. Cross-check the helpers. Soft hands on the nose. Protect the fix. He uncapped a marker and added a 5th line beneath them, small and plain. Guard what matters. Because some storms come from outside. And some come from within. And the next test, bigger, stranger, more dangerous, was already building at the edge of the radar, just beyond the line where clear air looks exactly like cloud. The first production certification flight was set for a clear Tuesday in June. The route traced a loop from Boeing Field out over the Olympics and back along the coast, terrain that could bruise an airplane if it felt like being honest. FAA observers took their seats in the telemetry room on the 10th floor, notebooks open, faces set to cautious. William Anderson stood behind Ava Morales at the console, headset on, eyes taking in 3 screens at once and the space between them. Rules on the whiteboard behind them were simple, almost childish in their neatness. Filter the noise. Cross-check the helpers. Soft hands on the nose. Protect the fix. Guard what matters. Caller 0901, cleared for takeoff, the tower said, voice calm as a heartbeat. The jet rolled, lifted, and slid into air the color of polished steel. For 20 minutes, everything looked like a brochure, curves smooth, margins clean, the airplane and the sky shaking hands like old colleagues who had finally agreed on the past. William let himself breathe. At minute 23, the first oddness crept in, nothing dramatic, a half-degree disagreement between AOA and vertical speed that should have cancelled itself out inside the filter. On Ava's screen, the residual plot blipped, then sat as if deciding whether to matter. You seeing that? Ava asked. I see it, William said. The blip returned at minute 26, a little wider, this time dragging airspeed into its argument. The triple vote still agreed, but the agreement felt forced, like a jury racing the clock. Ava's fingers hovered over a key. Sanity check is green. Expand the window, William said. Give me the power rail diagnostic. She threw the panel up. On the lower left, a thin trace most people ignored, ADC ref voltage, rode a tiny sawtooth across the screen, a shape you could miss if you were in love with prettier plots. Someone's leaning on the reference, William said, more to himself than the room. How? One of the FAA observers asked, pencil pausing. Not turbulence. Not random. This is a slow walk common mode. If you fool the reference, 3 sensors tell the same lie. William's voice stayed flat. Pilot override early. Now. Ava keyed the radio. 901, flight controls. You are seeing a benign trend on our side that we do not like. Switch to bus B on the ADC reference, confirm. Degrade autopilot to CWS mode. You have priority. Up front, the crew was 2 of their best, Captain Mirachin and FO Luis Ortega, both with the kind of calm you can borrow in a pinch. Copy, bus B selected, Mira said after a beat. CWS. Hands on. The traces wobbled like a person regaining balance on a moving train, then began to settle. The sawtooth vanished. The sanity checker fell back to a flat line and pretended it had been there all along. Say your intentions, Ava asked. Continuing westbound to the turn. We'll keep it in the box. Mira answered, voice steady. Thanks for the early call. In the telemetry room, a silence loosened. Someone exhaled like a tire finding air. The FAA observer made a note and didn't look up. William didn't relax. He was already working the other problem. If it's common mode, it isn't weather, he said. It's design or it's malice. And we didn't design that. Security Chief Tanya Reed stepped in from the doorway, as if her name had been called by thought alone. We just got a ping from facilities, she said quietly. Maintenance badge used last night on Bay 3, air data compartment. The badge belongs to a temp who hasn't clocked in today. Find him, Richard Coleman said from the back of the room, where he'd been standing so long his coffee had gone cold. And lock down Bay 3. No one breathes on that airplane when it lands. The jet made its turn over the gray teeth of the Olympics and came back home the way a story returns to its opening image when it wants to be artful. It touched down clean. On the rollout, Myra's voice cut in, lighter. We'll buy whoever saw that the first round tonight. Make it 2, Ava said, finally letting a smile show. Down on the ramp, Tanya's team met the airplane with blue gloves and a warrant in everything but name. In Bay 3, tucked into the tidy world of the Air Data/Inertial Reference Unit, they found a box the size of a deck of cards taped under a loom, a tiny programmable injector that could put its thumb on the reference rail and make truth lean just enough to matter. It wore a coat of matte gray paint and a sticker that said CalCheck in a font meant to be invisible. By dusk, SPD had a man in cuffs in a motel off East Marginal Way. He was 35, good at disappearing, bad at choosing employers. On his phone were 2 numbers. One was Dante Cruz's. The other was a prepaid that rang 3 times in a prison in Monroe, and then stopped ringing forever because someone had just made the mistake of using it the day they needed it least. In the conference room where good news usually went to have its picture taken, an FAA team watched Tanya lay the injector on a white towel like evidence in a movie. William stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulder tight, eyes on the little box that had tried to pretend physics was a democracy. Your system caught it, one of the observers said, not smiling, which is how observers say they're impressed. You built for error. You survived malice. William nodded once. We'll build for malice next. You already did, Ava said under her breath. The press never heard about the device. The report said anomalous common mode event mitigated per design, which is how the public record keeps the world from losing sleep. Inside the building, the story grew legs of its own. Engineers are not usually sentimental, but more than one of them left a sticky note on William's office door that said Rule 6 and nothing else. That night, after statements and signatures and the long paperwork that justice requires when it wants to stick, William drove home on I-90 with the city lit like a motherboard below. He pulled onto Mercer Island and sat in the driveway for a full minute, engine ticking, the lake a black sheet beyond the cedar fence. Inside, Julia was on the couch with Clinton asleep on her chest, the baby's mouth making the small, perfect O of dream. She looked up when William came in and didn't ask until she'd read his face. Safe landing, he said, dropping to the rug and resting his forehead against Clinton's tiny socks. Someone tried to make 3 good sensors believe the same lie. And our people didn't. She reached for his hand. We don't live scared, she reminded him, echoing his words back on a night she needed them. We live careful. He nodded, then stood and carried Clinton to the window. Outside, the water held the kind of stillness that isn't absence but presence behaving itself. William touched his son's forehead with one finger. Rule 6, he said softly, as much to himself as to the sleeping boy. Design like noise can hate you. In the weeks that followed, Coleman Aerospace turned the near miss into doctrine. They hardened the reference path, diversified rails, added a watchdog that didn't just check math but checked the way the math was arriving. Ava wrote a training module titled Malice Models, and made it required. The FAA stamped approvals that do not come easy. A rival sent a third note. It said simply, "We learned something from you today." Monroe Correctional added pages to a file. Dante Cruz got a sentence that made him stare at a wall and think about smaller decisions. The temp contractor flipped his plea and flipped his life into fewer options. Owen Kincaid's appeal was denied. When he heard about the injector, he put his head back against concrete and laughed once, a sound with no joy in it. One afternoon in late summer, William walked the edge of a job site under I-5 where a city crew was moving a camp along like rain moves a stain. He didn't come to watch. He came to wait. A kid he'd seen twice, skinny, smart in the way eyes are smart, sat on an overturned bucket with a paperback on his knee, Intro to Flight, pages swollen from weather. You an airplane guy? William asked, stopping a polite distance away. Trying, the kid said, chin up like a dare. William sat on the curb. I was too, he said. Still am. They talked for 20 minutes about lift the way you talk about money when you don't have enough, carefully. William didn't tell the kid who he was. He didn't need to. He wrote a number on the inside cover and a name that could open a door at a community college and another one at Coleman. He left his old pen in the gutter because it felt like the right kind of magic, then picked it back up because pens are not magic, work is. That evening, William framed the dog-eared aeronautical book he'd carried through rain and years. He hung it in his office, not over the desk like a trophy, but low, near a chair where interns sat, where hands could touch it. When people asked why it was reachable, he said, "Because ideas break if you put them out of reach." On a Friday at dusk, the war room emptied into a hallway that smelled like dry erase and pizza and the soft relief of a week finished on the right side of the ledger. Richard leaned in William's doorway. You coming to the roof? He asked. Ava's threatening to play music again. In a minute, William said. He turned to the whiteboard. Under the 5 rules, he wrote a 6th line in small block letters and stepped back to see if it belonged. Design like noise can hate you. He capped the marker and listened to the building. The 10th floor hummed, the way machines hum when human beings have told them who they are. Down the hall, someone laughed. Outside, a fairy blew a horn that sounded like a future clearing its throat. William switched off the office light and headed for the stairs. He felt the weight of a child who slept on his chest, the steadiness of a woman who laughed the dark quieter, the press of a city that had tried to break him and had instead taught him how not to break. Soft hands, he thought, not just on the nose of an airplane, but on the story you build when you finally get to decide who you are. 3 months later, Coleman Aerospace stopped talking about a fix and started talking about a platform. The rules that had saved one airplane were being baked into everything that moved: regional jets, bizliners, and a new unmanned air vehicle the Pentagon wanted to fly in contested weather. They called the program Skylark. William Anderson led the controls team. Ava Morales ran integration. Richard Coleman worked the politics the way only a CEO who'd almost lost everything knows how. On a Monday that smelled like rain and copier toner, the team briefed an FAA/DoD joint review in a windowless conference room. William set down a folder with a title that made 2 colonels lift their eyebrows: Guardian Layer, Human First Override for Learning Systems. We've all seen what rule-based logic can do when sensors get noisy, he said. Skylark adds machine learning for pattern recognition in crosswinds and shear. That's good, until the model sees a pattern it was never taught to fear. Guardian inserts hard rails. If the model wants to do something that breaks the physics or the pilot's declared intent, we catch it and downgrade. Humans write the last line. A colonel with a haircut that looked like it could cut paper tapped his pen. And if your learning has learned to hide its bad impulses? Then we watch how it's deciding, Ava said, flipping to a page labeled Provenance Monitors. We're measuring the input distribution and the internal activations. If they walk off the map stops driving. Design like noise can hate you, William added. Now assume data can lie too. They scheduled the fly-off at Grant County International in Moses Lake. Big sky, long concrete, no one to complain if a prototype screamed. The test card read like a dare: gusts, shear, partial pitot icing simulated through the environmental pack, then an autoland and uncertain crosswinds. On the morning of the demo, a pale sun burned through high haze. A chase plane idled, a telemetry truck hummed, and 3 government observers stood with their hands in their pockets like golfers waiting on a tee box they didn't trust. William and Ava strapped headsets on in the mobile control room. Richard hovered near the back with a coffee he forgot he was holding. Skylark 1, cleared to taxi, Tower said. The UAV rolled, nimble and mean, a wedge of intention on tricycle gear. Filter the noise. Cross-check the helpers, Ava murmured, a habit now, like pilots who mouth checklists when nobody's listening. Soft hands, William said, almost a prayer, almost a joke. Takeoff was smooth. The first 2 test points were boring in the best way. Curves clean, margins fat, the guardian layer never waking because there was nothing to guard. Then came the third, a programmed shear with an ugly gust front layered on top. The residuals danced. The model sniffed something that looked like a pattern from training, but not quite. For a blink, its choice vector bent toward an aggressive nose-down correction that would have worked in clear air and killed them in this box. Guardian woke. A translucent banner slid across William's screen. Intent protect, model derated, and control passed to the conservative rules set with early pilot authority. The pitch cue eased, not stabbed. The UAV rode the bump like a boxer rolling with a punch. Guardian caught it, Ava said, exhaling. Copy, William said. He watched the provenance traces fall back into the green corridor they'd drawn over months. Proceed to Autoland. On short final, the crosswind wobbled like a drunk. The model suggested a flare timing that was pretty enough for a brochure and wrong enough to scrape a tail. Guardian clipped its wings again. Human intent, stability priority, and the UV settled like a tired bird that still knew how to land. Silence, then radio applause masquerading as protocol. Skylark 1 roll out. Exit left. Well done. In the control room, nobody high-fived. They were too tired for theater. Ava leaned back and closed her eyes for a second longer than practicality allows. William didn't sit at all. He stood with his palms on the console and stared at the line where the model had almost fooled them by being good. Write it up, he said. Every bump. Every intervention. We teach the next flight not to make the same almost mistake. By sunset, the observers had what they came for, a system that did not confuse clever with safe. One of them pulled Richard aside on the ramp. Your people respected the human, he said. In Regulator, that was poetry. Back in Seattle, the building treated success like fuel. The Guardian layer moved from prototype to doctrine. Ava drafted a training called Malice, Drift, and Pride, How Good Systems Go Stupid, and made it mandatory. William wrote a memo he'd wanted to write for a decade. Humans write the last line. It went company-wide. No one edited the title. While Skylark turned into a contract with more commas than comfort, life threaded itself through the days. Julia went back to work part-time, spreadsheets and forecasts and a baby monitor parked beside a laptop. In the evenings, they traded Clinton like a relay baton and learned that love sometimes looks like washing bottles at 11:47 p.m. On Wednesdays, William drove to the underpass where he used to sleep. The city had moved most of the camp along, but not the gravity. Malik Carter, the skinny kid with the intro to flight paperback, kept showing up on the curb with a mechanical pencil and questions. What's the difference between lift coefficient and just lift? he asked one afternoon, forehead creased. Coefficient is the way we talk about lift without arguing about wingspan and speed, William said, drawing a curve on the back of a fast food bag. It lets you compare truth across airplanes. Malik nodded like he just found a lever that moved something heavy. William slid an envelope across the curb, a voucher for a community college intro class, a note to a professor who owed him a favor, a visitor badge to Coleman with mentor, W. Anderson scrawled in sharpened. You're not saving me, Malik said, chin firmer than the rest of him. I can't, William said. I can only hold the door. You decide if you walk through. On a Friday evening in August, a letter arrived with a return address William hadn't seen in years, Fort Collins, Colorado. He turned it in his hands for a full minute before he sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Dad, it began. He didn't breathe for one exactly measured second. I don't know if this is right. I don't even know if you'll read it. Mom told us one story. Life told us others. When I turned 19, I did a thing you'll laugh at. I got a DNA kit for Christmas. I wanted to know who I am. The results said what you already saw once. But they also said something else. I'm 27% Scandinavian. Mom's not. Her husband's not. You are. Jeremy and I started asking questions nobody wanted to answer. I'm not writing to reopen pain. I'm writing because I'd like to see the person I remember from a few flashes. Hands that taught me how to tie a knot. A laugh that showed up exactly when it was supposed to. I'm in Seattle next month for a coding boot camp. If you want to meet, there's a diner on Aurora where the coffee is bad and honest. Saturday, the 12th, noon. If you don't come, I'll understand. If you do, I'll be there. David. William stared at the page until the words blurred. Julia found him there and sat thigh to thigh, not touching the letter, touching his hand instead. What does your last line say? She asked. That we go, he said, and heard his own voice from a dozen rooms where he had insisted machines listen to people. Now he listened to himself. The diner on Aurora Avenue smelled like breakfast no matter what time it was. David was already in a booth, taller, sharper, carrying a nervousness that looked like courage with a paper cut. William stood a second just watching, the way you watch a plane you love taxi in from a flight you weren't on. David, he said. Hi, David said. His smile was new and familiar. They talked the way a bridge is built, one span, then the next, piers sunk into stories both of them had been afraid to walk on. David knew about the arrest. He didn't know about the planted pills. He knew about the divorce. He didn't know about the underpass. William did not give him a villain. He gave him facts, and apologies that had taken years to grow skin, and a promise. I won't disappear again. If you want me in the room, I'll be in the room. They walked out into Seattle light that couldn't decide what it wanted, and it didn't matter. They had decided. On Monday, Tanya Reed intercepted William at the atrium with a look that had never learned how to be casual. News you should hear from me first, she said. The Monroe call traffic that lit up during Skylark? DOC traced a node to a contractor tied to your ex's private investigator from 8 years ago. The one who found the pills. William's jaw clicked. The room never shifted. Can we reopen? The DA in Snohomish is interested, Tanya said. It may not put anyone in cuffs this time, but it might take a weight off your name. I don't need cuffs, William said. He looked past her to the war room where his rules hung in marker. I need the record to tell the truth. That afternoon, William taught a brown bag seminar titled Writing the Last Line. Interns filled the doorway. Ava sat on the floor with a notebook like she might be a student again, just for an hour. Write rules you can remember when the room is loud, William said, tapping the board. Give humans the big voice early. Check what's deciding, not just the decision. And if you ever build a system that can only be trusted when it's praised, tear it down and start over. He capped the marker. Also, he added deadpan, eat before the meeting that decides your fate. You think better when your hands don't shake from hunger. Laughter loosened the room. Richard, leaning in the doorway, shook his head. You're going to make me sentimental in front of engineers, he said. That's against code, Ava said. Write a waiver, Richard shot back. On the drive home, with Clinton gurgling at birds through the rear window, William took the long route along Lake Washington. Boats stitched small wakes into the water. The city to the west glowed like a circuit board refusing to short. At Mercer Island, he parked and sat for a beat before he killed the engine. In the front yard, a toy airplane Clinton had launched earlier lay in the grass, nose down, wings fine, nothing broken. William picked it up on his way inside, set it on the entry table, and pressed 2 fingers to the paper wings in a gesture that was prayer and habit and something in between. In his office, the old aeronautical book hung where hands could reach it. The whiteboard held 6 lines now, the last one written smaller than it deserved. Design like noise can hate you. He uncapped a marker and, after a long, quiet second, wrote a 7th beneath it. Humans write the last line. No one clapped. No one was there. It didn't matter. The building hummed. The lake breathed. A baby laughed in the next room at something only babies can see. William stood with his palm flat against the board until the cold of the glass turned warm. Then he turned up the light and went to hold what mattered. By October, the past knocked with a judge's gavel instead of nightmares. Tanya Reed called William into a conference room with blinds that never quite closed and set a slim folder in front of him like a ticket out of weather. Snohomish County DA filed a post-conviction relief petition, she said. New evidence ties the private investigator your ex hired, Martin Hale, to Cruz's network. Bank wires, burner calls, and a patrol officer who just flipped and swore under oath he was told to find something in your briefcase or find a new beat. William's hands stayed flat on the table. Does the record get fixed, or just my mood? Tanya's mouth tugged. Hearing is Thursday. Bring a suit you don't mind remembering. The courthouse smelled like paper and determinations. Judge Carol Lynn read with the care of someone defusing, then looked over her glasses. Mr. Anderson, the state stipulates to vacating your conviction based on new evidence of investigatory misconduct and fabrication. Your petition is granted. The case is dismissed with prejudice. The record will reflect that you did not do what you were accused of doing. The words landed like a weight lifted off a bridge. William exhaled once, the way an airplane settles into smooth air after chop. The former patrolman, older now, eyes newer, stopped him in the hallway and said, I'm sorry. William nodded and said, Thank you, which is sometimes how you leave a room right. That night on Mercer Island, Julia set the court order on the mantel like a photograph. Clinton toddled past with a rubber plane, smacking it into chair legs until physics agreed. William lifted his son up and kissed the back of a soft neck that smelled like apples and soap. The next call came from a number he had memorized in a different life. William, Paige Baxter said, brittle and careful. I heard. He could have said 1,000 things. He chose. I know. Martin told me you'd done worse, she said. He told me what to see. I wanted to believe him. The sentence collapsed into an apology that never found the right tense. I'm sorry. We can tell the truth without reopening the house, William said, voice level. Our boys deserve that. So do we. They met at a lawyer's office with glass walls and bottled water. Paige's hair was shot with gray now. Her eyes still jumped to the smallest sounds. They agreed to a letter for the file and a version of history the family could live with. When William stood, Paige did too. You always loved airplanes, she said, not a question. They loved me back. He didn't add, eventually. On a Saturday that didn't promise sun and delivered it anyway, William met Jeremy at Gasworks Park. David came too, taller and less wary than their diner day. The 3 of them stood in a wind that tried to make itself important and didn't succeed. Jeremy stuck his hands in his hoodie. So you're the reason I like taking things apart. Your mother would say I'm the reason you forget where you put the screws, William said. Jeremy barked a laugh, surprised to find it there. They walked the ridge, talked about nothing until it was something. William didn't claim a title he hadn't earned. He offered one you can't take back. I'll be where you look if you look. Back at Coleman, Skylark turned from demo to doctrine. Contracts printed in font sizes that made CFOs sentimental. The Guardian layer moved into production software. A version scaled down to commuter aircraft spun up in parallel. Ava Morales accepted a badge that now said VP, Flight Systems Integration. William dodged a corner office and took Chief Systems Architect instead, closer to whiteboards, farther from calendar wars. Washington, D.C. called with the tone of a summons dressed as an invitation. The Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee scheduled a hearing, Autonomy and Aviation, Safety Beyond the Hype. William packed 1 suit, 2 ties, and 7 rules written on a card. Heart-building hearing rooms turned nerves into choreography. Senators asked to be reassured and to be warned. William did both. Automation doesn't fail because it's evil, he said into the mic. It fails because it is certain. We designed a Guardian layer that respects physics and people. When the model wants something outside the map or the pilot's declared intent, we downgrade. Humans write the last line. If you regulate one thing, regulate that. A senator from a plain state squinted. And what if your humans are tired or proud? Then we build systems that listen early and make asking for help look like competence, he said. Pride is in error mode too. Afterward, a staffer with a good pen asked for language. William handed over sentences he'd already tested on airplanes. Back home, life threaded itself between headlines. Julia returned to FP&A 3 days a week, spreadsheets sharing desk space with a baby monitor and a glow-in-the-dark pacifier Clinton pretended to negotiate with. On Wednesdays after work, William drove under I-5 and found Malik Carter on the curb with a new notebook he treated like it might bite. How'd the placement test go? William asked. Worse than I wanted and better than it used to, Malik said, showing a math score with the kind of pride that sneaks. I start statics Monday. William slid a laminated badge across. Coleman Aerospace, Visitor, Mentor, W. Anderson. A note in the corner. Guardian Scholar number 001. What's that? Malik asked, chin lifting. An experiment, William said. Richard matched funds for a small scholarship pool. We'll mess it up and fix it. You'll help me make the second one better. I'm not a project, Malik said. Neither is an airplane, William answered. We still check the load paths. In November, the DA's office called again. Hale pled to 3 counts. Tanya reported, breath cold on the phone from a parking lot where radios always hummed. He gave up the officer who planted your pills and 2 more clients. Some stories are learning to tell themselves without you in the middle. William stood in the atrium under a skylight that pulled a rectangle of winter into the building. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a calibration click. The next bump came quiet, the way good bumps do. A pilot flying a route over Montana radioed in a quirk, a small, repeatable drift in a sensor cluster during a narrow temperature band at high altitude. The system caught it. Guardian yawned and did what it was built to do. The jet landed fine. William had a team on it by lunch, a fix and sim by midnight, a fleet patch by end of week. Ava wrote the incident report like a love letter to boring competence. Regulators sent a note that said simply, noted. December brought a Christmas tree that Clinton decided to reorganize by reach. William found himself on the floor more nights than not, building plastic airports that refused to obey FAA's separation rules. Julia sat on the couch with a glass of wine and a smile that had learned to hold layers. You ever think about teaching more? She asked one night, watching him narrate the difference between yeah and no. Buddy, that's just spinning. I teach all day, he said. I mean, the kind where people have to call you professor and you get to wear those jackets with elbow patches. She grinned when he winced. Okay, not that. But the world keeps asking you to write things down. He looked at the whiteboard in his office later, and the 7 rules and marker still smelling a little like the factory. He uncapped a pen and stood a long minute, listening to the house. When he wrote, the letters were smaller than they felt. Leave the door open. He stared at it until the rule stopped being a sentence and turned into posture. The next morning, he sent 3 emails. one to the dean of a community college about night seminars and control systems for people who fixed cars by day, one to a state foster program about internships that didn't require knowing the right uncle, one to a reporter who had called him a miracle and who now needed to understand that what saved airplanes was not miracles but people who showed up and did the next correct thing. News kept trying to make him into a headline. He kept trying to make himself into a staircase. On New Year's Eve, the 10th floor roof held a little illegal gathering with paper cups and a Bluetooth speaker that betrayed Ava's taste. Seattle's skyline threw light like confetti. Richard clapped William on the shoulder and said, "You made us the company I thought I was building." "We did it together," William said, "because true doesn't have to be modest to be true." "Don't get philosophical. It makes my shareholders itchy," Richard said. He tilted his head at the edge of the roof. "What's next?" William looked across the sound where darkness meant depth, not danger. He thought of planes that could lie less and listen more, of boys who could meet their fathers in diners without changing their names, of kids on curbs finding load paths that lead to doorways. "Guard what matters," he said. "Then hand it forward." Midnight came soft. Fireworks stitched color over water. Back on Mercer Island, Clinton woke, protested, accepted a shoulder. William stood at the window with a child who didn't know about underpasses or court orders or the way an entire life can turn on a soft-handed correction at the right second. In the home office, the board held 8 lines now. Filter the noise. Cross-check the helpers. Soft hands on the nose. Protect the fix. Guard what matters. Design like noise can hate you. Humans write the last line. Leave the door open. He set the cap on the marker and let his palm rest against the glass until it warmed. Outside, a fairy horn sounded like a future you could believe in. Inside, a family breathed in even time. Somewhere under concrete, a kid studied for statics because a door had been left open and because he had decided to walk through. Some endings don't close. They turn into rules you try to live by, and airplanes that keep their promises, and mornings where the sky over a city that almost broke you is just a little cleaner than you remember.